So, our focus for this week is looking at the big picture context of Matthew, the whole gospel, before we delve into detail in chapter 25. Each of the gospels was written at a slightly different time and for a particular audience. Biblical scholars believe that Matthew's gospel was likely written toward the end of the first century of the Common Era, maybe 50 years or so after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. At this time in the early church, there were some Christ followers from Jewish families who maintained both their Jewish religious and cultural identity and the teachings and practices of the new Christian community. But they were in the minority as the church grew in Gentile areas, and they were also seen as outsiders by most Jewish people. To quote from the Bible Study Guide, Matthew's gospel was written for these second-generation Jewish Christians, struggling to make sense of their identity as children of Israel and followers of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew is structured around 5 major discourses of Jesus' teaching. Some scholars suggest that this structure is meant to remind the hearer of the first 5 books of the Bible, called the Torah, which are the foundation of Jewish law and teaching. In this week's Bible study, we're going to refresh our memories on the surrounding passages and spend a little time on each of these 5 discourses. So you might want to pause the video, and if you don't have your Bible available or a Bible app for reference as we continue, you might want to pull that out. And if you have the time, please go ahead and read through the entire Gospel of Matthew this week, especially if you haven't read it before, or else just skim through and focus your reading on the specific passages that we'll be mentioning that'll go along with the reflection questions. Matthew's Gospel begins by tracing Jesus' lineage. Extended family relationships are really important in the culture of the original Testament of the Bible. And Jesus' family tree includes a number of key figures from the history of the Hebrew people, which sets him up as someone special and important right from the start of the gospel. We can also notice that Matthew includes a number of women whose unconventional stories were part of his family line, which gives us a foretaste of the fact that this story will be challenging assumptions and expectations rather than reinforcing stereotypes. So we'll want to stay connected to this thread of unconventional breaking with tradition that will be part of Jesus' story throughout the gospel. Then we come to the familiar stories of Jesus' birth, to Mary and Joseph. We see the wise men, we see the family's time as refugees in Egypt, the slaughter of baby boys who were born around the same time as Jesus near Bethlehem. Then fast forward to Jesus' adulthood, and we hear John the Baptist's preaching. We see Jesus' baptism and the 40 days he spends in the desert. After this, Jesus learns that John has been imprisoned. And this alerts us to the dangers involved in the life and ministry that Jesus is called to, since his cousin John is a political prisoner for teaching the same core message that Jesus has come to announce. So Jesus relocates to get a little distance from the situation. He moves to the town of Capernaum on the shores of Lake Galilee and begins to call his disciples. Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John all leave behind their fishing nets to follow Jesus, whose fame grows as he teaches, preaches, and heals people all over Galilee. The first of the 5 discourses in the Gospel of Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount, which covers basically all of chapters 5, 6, and 7. Reflection questions for this discourse. Please first read over Matthew 4:23 through 7:29 and ask yourself, who is the audience that Jesus is addressing? What do you imagine about the situation, hopes, and social identity of the people who follow Jesus and hear this message? What elements of the Sermon on the Mount speak to you? What's familiar or unfamiliar? What questions do you have? Is there anything you particularly like or dislike in the Sermon on the Mount? And if you would like to dig a little deeper, I'd invite you to read Walter Wink's essay, Jesus' Third Way, and learn what Jesus probably meant when he taught about turning the other cheek, which, just to give you a bit of a teaser, it's not at all what most people have been brought up to think that it means. There will be a link to that article in the resources.